Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. I'm so glad to see you here. Some of the faces are just like we met yesterday or the day before yesterday. So it's nice that we have the opportunity to meet each other here through the Shindig. So today we are going to talk about some other topic, obviously different from yesterday and the day before yesterday. And David is here. Hello, David.
Hi, thank you for having me, and welcome everybody to the case study refresher.
Right. So, yes, as David mentioned, the topic is case study refresher. Basically, the purpose is providing very brief overview about case study. So as you know, case study design is very extensive. Obviously, we cannot cover all the details in just 1 hour session. The purpose here is providing some overview and also discussing about some of the major confusions and issues in the design related to case study design. Dr. Proudfoot is here with me, and throughout the session, if you have any question, you may type your question and David can read, and I will answer the questions. In addition, at the end of the session, we have a time to discuss and answer your question. So,
Dr. Cabrici, there's two ways for participants. If you have not been on this platform before, there are two ways to ask a question to me. You can send me an instant message, which is an IM, by clicking on the administrator icon, since I'm the administrator, and sending me an instant message. You can send your question that way. Or you can click the question mark icon, which is how you could pose a question. And I would see it privately, and then I would be able to read that at the end when it's time for questions. So those are the two ways that we could ask questions for this session.
Very well. Yes. So the agenda of today is, as I mentioned, briefly going over the definition of case study. Really, what does it mean when we are saying case study? What do we mean by that? And then, like I said, I'm going to talk about some major issues, like the confusions that we always hear from the researchers when they are doing case study. I would talk about those issues. I'm going to talk about the case study design, and at the end answer your questions. I have references at the end of the session. For additional information, you can always go to the references. So David, can you make this larger, the slide? Because it's tiny, I guess for some people it's hard to read.
Yeah.
So
hang on, let me take it down and move it back up, and I'll try and make it larger for you.
Okay. I can read, but I have the glasses, really. If I take it out, I cannot. So, so the definition, I'll go over the definition. Basically, let me first explain that there are, okay, here is better. This is better. Okay. So, when it comes to case study, there are a few leaders in the field of case study, and perhaps you heard about them: Yin, Robert Rinn, Miriam, and then Steig. These are the major leader in the case study, and they provide slightly different definition for case study. And I purposefully included these because I just wanted to start with the notion that when it comes to the research design and method, you hear different sort of perspective. And there are different type of school of thoughts, really. And it's fine. You can just read different, you can get yourself familiar with different perspective. But at the end, once you decide to implement a study, in this instance, case study, you may want to pick one of them and follow them. So for example, you may go with Yin or you may go with Miriam. They have some similarity and they have some differences as well. There are even some studies that basically the articles that compare and contrast these three leaders and their definition and suggestion related to case studies. So if you're interested, I can provide those articles for you as well. So Yin start explaining basically the case study as an empirical inquiry that investigating contemporary phenomena. We can call this case within a real life context. And the boundary between the phenomenon and context are not clearly evident. That's what Yin is saying. So there are some keywords here. You see the real life context. So always case study happen in real life context. I will further explain down on my presentation what do we really mean by that. No, David, can we go back to the? Okay. But then you see that the next definition coming from Miriam is saying that the case study is an in-depth description and analysis of a bounded system. So there is a slightly differences between these two definitions. Miriam referred to case study basically as like a phenomenon that is absolutely should be circulated and bounded within a system. And then Stake also is saying the same thing. These two authors are agree that the what is the bounded system and is like a single entity, a unit that we can absolutely have a boundary around it. So I just wanted to point out that Yin and Miriam and Stake here, they have a little bit differences when it comes to having a clear-cut boundary around the case or not. That's their slightly different opinion. But as we move toward the slide, I'm telling you that Yin also getting closer to this perspective that we need to clearly explain and have a boundary around our case and unit of analysis. So in this presentation, I mostly present a procedure based on Yin perspective toward cases. I may bring some other stuff, but mostly Yin. So again, like I know as I talk to many researchers, it's very confusing when we talk about case. Really, what is the case? Let's define the case by itself. So case usually is a phenomenon, an event, a program, something within a context, but we should be able to have a boundary around that context. As you see, I made this graph because I thought it's easier for you to understand if I provide this visual presentation. That, for example, we have a organization and we want to study the students. Perhaps we can say that minority, let's say African American students in a high school. So we need to clearly define our high school and have a boundary around it. So our context is the high school, and the students in that particular school, they are our case in our study. So those students should be specifically identified in advance, and we should know who are they. Those are our case, and then our school is our context. And as you see, that the school is particularly is clear context. So it's different from other research that other studies that we are, for example, interested in learning about African American students. It can be any high school as long as that high school meet our criteria, right? In case study, we have different approach. We are saying that no, it's not that we are going after any high school. We are interested in studying students in this particular high school. So that's how we are saying that it's bonded, and there are not so many African Americans, unlimited number of African Americans in that high school. There are limited number, so that's why it's like a bonded system. So I hope it's clear, because this is something that I often hear that is very confusing for researchers. David, can we go to the next? Okay, so this is the example that I added to make it more clear. For example, if you are going to have a study on how older adults learn to use computers, the unit of analysis or the case here is learner's experience, right? But we can have an unlimited number of adult learners, right, for this study. We can have any adult learners who have experience working with computer for our study. So then this is not a right study for a case study. It can be a qualitative study with other design, but not case study. Now, if we start changing our perspective and we are saying that, oh, we are interested in learning about adult learner in one particular program or classroom based on their particular characteristic, then we can say that we have a case study. So always there should be a specific particular program or system or classroom in order to be qualified for a case study. Is it clear, David, or others? I mean, if I can further explain if it's not. I think you are mute, David. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, it's clear. We have one question right now, but it's not related to the content that's being presented. So we'll save that to the end.
Okay. Okay. Now, okay. So we are switching to when to use the case study. So usually we use the case study when we are going to answer the question of how or why something happened. How or why something happened. Then the case study can be appropriate. It wouldn't be appropriate for questions that are going after clear-cut cause and effect, the one that we just want to see what was the effect of X and Y, that those are good for experimental quasi-experimental design. Or how often something happened, just simply you are going after frequency or something, then you may go with survey design, not case study.
Dr. Parikh, I have a question. I was reading this article one time about different types of methodology, and it shared that, or the author shared that the case study design is at kind of like, if you look at a spectrum, kind of like at the weaker end of the spectrum when it comes to like valid results or the strength of the design. What are your thoughts on that? Is that true, or is that an opinion? So how could we maybe, I don't know if that comes into play here about when to use the case study or not.
So I will talk about some concern that has been raised related to case study. Basically, if you are apply case study in the right place with the right research question, you are fine. I think the weakness comes when in a situation that you are not properly using it. There are procedures that we need to take in order to have a right case study, right? But if you are using it in a wrong place, and if you are not really following the procedure for data collection, data analysis, then we may end up with a weak study.
So this
but I
slide,
think, yeah,
questions really. This is really important. This having the right type of questions is key.
Right. Exactly.
Great. Thank you.
And the other places when to use the data case study, we use it in the places that we are collecting data in natural setting. So what do we mean with natural setting? Always we collect data from natural places, right? They are not in the Mars, right? But when we are saying natural setting, meaning that we are not just driving data by sending one instrument or one survey. We try to really understand the phenomenon from different perspectives by collecting multiple data sources. So as I will explain later on, the hallmark of case study is collecting data from at least 3 different sources. The reason is that we want to really understand the phenomenon or the event or the case in its natural setting. So the example is how or why a high school principal did an exceptionally good job. We can do this with a case study, but in order to really answer this question, we cannot just collect data from one survey. We cannot even go with just one set of interview. Or we may not go just by asking students' perspective. We need to have multiple sources of data to be able to really capture the event and understand really why this principal is doing a great job, for example. So when I'm saying natural setting means that like really data should not be just like episodically we send one set of data. We have to have a lot of interaction and data sources from the setting. So if you are going to use the case study, keep in mind that you have to be able to at least collect 3 sources of data. If you cannot do it, then maybe case study is not the right design for you. So the next, also in case study, we are not manipulating behavior of the people. We are not manipulating any variable as we do in mostly in quantitative, but in case study we don't do such thing. And the next slide. There are a number of evaluation studies that I have seen, and also I saw that the report in Yin article that they use case studies. So case study design is appropriate for evaluation. If happen that you want to evaluate a program, perhaps case study is one of the appropriate design that you may select for your study. And the next slide. And now switching to the design, actually, I wanted to first explain what do I mean when I talk about research design. We are talking about an action plan. The action plan that take us from the research questions to our results, really. So it's just like a really procedural plan that we need to use for case study. So if you go to the next slide, these are the steps that actually Yin suggested. Again, if you go to Miriam have some different set of procedures. But like I said, as long as you are following one of these, you should be fine. So the first step is research question that I explained briefly earlier. We got to have a proposition, and by proposition is just like suggestion that what do you think is slightly similar to a hypothesis that we have in quantitative, but I will explain further what I mean by proposition, but just to let you know that for case study, in exploratory case study that we just explore, we just need to have a purpose because we don't know what we are going to hypothesize here, right? So we just have a purpose as our proposition. Defining the case or unit of analysis is another steps that I slightly talked about it earlier. And selecting the design. Again, there are a number of design for case study that I will explain in the following slides. We also need to have a logical linking between our data and our proposition or the purpose of the study. So this goes back to data analysis that I will explain. We need to have a criteria for interpreting our findings, continuously keeping up with our plan and moving everything, trying to compare and contrast with what we have as our proposition. And using a theory also is important. So I will talk about all of these in the following slides.
We have a couple questions, Dr. Kerici. Can we pause for a minute and ask a couple based on the previous slides?
Sure.
Okay. The one question is the slide which addressed descriptive, explanatory, and exploratory types of case studies. Could you elaborate on the difference in those types?
Yes, actually, there is one particular slide related to that. So I will talk about this. Was it the only one? Because I will talk about this in the following slides, the types of case studies.
Then hold off on that one. Here's another one. Thank you for clarifying the need for multiple data sources. Are there certain methods that go well together? For instance, do maybe interview and focus group or surveys and something else?
Right. So again, I will talk about the different type of the data collection. But if you're asking which one is really go well with the other one, it really depends on the case. So you can go with interview, and then depending on your situation, have a survey first, then interview, then maybe a focus group, or maybe you can use archive data, then interview, and then perhaps having a focus group. It depends on your case really, but usually these are the types are like interviewing, surveying, using archive data, focus group, observation, field notes. So sometimes when you interview people, what they say might be a little bit different from what their facial reaction is. So collecting the field notes is yet another source of data that you can use. So we are going to actually triangulate, and we put together all of these. We are not going to separately analyze these. The purpose is really looking at this case from different perspectives. And then once we sit and analyze, we want to see if all of these match or not. And if it does not match, actually, if you see some finding, emerging theme, something that only is in your interview but not in survey or not in your archive data, then you may have a question mark on that how did I end up with this, but my other data sources, they don't really confirm that. So okay. Yeah, so that's the case. Yeah, and I will talk about all of these.
Okay, we had a question about the different data sources, but I think you answered that one in what you just shared. Do you want one more, or do you want to keep going?
I mean, I can going on because, like, I don't know if the questions will be perhaps answered in the following slide. If not, then I will answer them. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We'll just table them and ask them in a little bit.
Okay. So the proposition that I mentioned we need to have at the beginning, basically, it help the researcher limit the scope of the study. So when we just start having with a research question and we don't really add any proposition, we are kind of in a free land, right? We can just explore, which is fine, but it's harder to manage this study. So the recommendation, particularly for novice researcher, is to have a proposition. And proposition, again, is like hypothesis. What do you expect? You may later on learn to really revise your proposition. That's fine. But it's good to start with some statement to begin with, and later on you may end up with revising it, or later on you may see that, oh, what you thought was really right. And also, the proposition help you increase the feasibility of completing the study. Again, if you have a clear purpose and you have a expectation, you can better collect your data, and you can have a better plan to finish the entire study. And so how do we really find these propositions? You can review the literature, and based on the review of literature, you come up with a statement, or based on your professional experience, you may come up with a proposition. Perhaps maybe you have read some study, and based on the result of some study, you may come up with a suggestion. It's just there are different ways to really come up with a proposition. And so one example that I added here is that you may say that staff is promoted in an organization based on their skills, really. That's very simple position that you may have. For example, if your research question focus on why staff or how staff is promoted in one organization, then your proposition is staff is promoted based on their skills. But that's what you think. You may end up finding out that, oh, that was not the case. They were promoted maybe based on, I don't know, their relationship with higher manager, which is not a good thing, but it may happen in some organizations. But still, you got to have some proposition at the beginning to be able to really manage your study. So that's for proposition. And this is related to the type of case studies and the question that was asked. So we have descriptive case study that we basically, in descriptive, we are going to describe the phenomenon in a real life context. We are just simply describing. And I added the example of the study related to descriptive case study. For example, coping with menstruation, understanding the needs of women with Parkinson's disease. So that's simply the researcher wanted to know the needs of the women with Parkinson's disease, really. So that's one type. The other one is exploratory. You try to explore the situation that usually one intervention or treatment is being evaluated, really. So there is one intervention or treatment, and you try to evaluate it, and you try to explore those sort of situations. But we call it exploratory because you are not really clear about the outcome, right? So you are just exploring. And that's why I mentioned in the earlier slide that for exploratory studies, maybe you cannot add proposition, you would just add a purpose, because you are not really clear about what you are going to find out in this study. And so one example is the study related to observation of development of a nurse-patient relationship. So in this study, the researchers simply try to explore their relationship, these nurse and patient relationship. And the nurses use some sort of treatment and intervention, and basically these researchers wanted to know how the relation changed or influenced by the treatment of the nurse. So that's one example related to exploratory. And then the next one is explanatory. Yeah. So basically, the last one, the researcher tried to explain some sort of causal relationship in the real context, the intervention, and there's a real context in a real context. So it's not a clear-cut cause and effect that we have in experimental. Keep in mind, it's just some sort of presumed causal link. That I remember one study that, I added another study. I said, like, the example is analyzing a web-based e-commerce learning community. That was one study. But the other study that I read and I think was interesting was related to, for example, in Connecticut, and this was a real study, that researchers wanted to find out if we bring down the speed limit to 55, we would reduce the accident or not. So that's like, you see, it's like a causal link. It's not a clear-cut cause and effect and experiment, and it's in a real context. So then the researcher use explanatory case study. So that's one example for that study. And so in addition to type of case studies, we have types of designs. So that's different. I don't want to make it confusing. That's the type, like the focus of this case study was like the 3 types that I mentioned. And here we talk about the type of design that we are using. So this is the chart that I thought, again, I use it to make it easier for you to understand. So remember at the beginning, I had this circle and in the middle was just a smaller circle. That was the case and the context. Here is the same thing, case and context. So if we have just one case and one context, so let's say that the context is one organization and one issue in that organization, we have single case design and it's holistic. And if we have in the same organization 2 issues to explore, we would have 2 cases. So it would be embedded cases, but still is holistic. And then we have multiple cases. Here we have multiple organizations. Instead of one organization, we have multiple organizations, but we have the same case in multiple organizations. So this would be multiple cases and it's holistic. And then here in the 4th level, we have multiple organizations and we have more than one case in each organization. And this is called embedded multiple case studies. And I hope I have not confused you. Did I? I can give you the example here. Okay. The context
I think the chart
is
really helps.
Chart help or does not help?
I think it does for those visual people out there. Do you want to hear some questions?
Yeah, let me bring the example to clarify and then I also answer the question. So let's say that if the context is organization and the case that you are interested to learn is, let's go back to the example of staff promotion policy. Staff promotion policy is your case. And then the context is the organization. So you have one case, single case, and holistic. And then here in the second model, you have, again, one organization. The case is a staff promotion policy. But in addition to staff promotion policy, you are interested in learning about a group of employees as well. So then you have 2 units of analysis. The first one is policy. The second one is the employees. So when we have only one case, the case and unit of analysis is the same. There is one thing. But once we switch to more than one case, basically each unit of analysis would be like one case would end up with 2 units of analysis. And then here we have multiple organizations, but we are only looking for the policy for promotion. So this is the case for multiple cases in holistic. And then in the 4th version, we have multiple organizations and we are looking for 2 units of analysis in each organization. One is the policy and the other one is actually the group of employees. Clear? I hope. Okay, tell me about the questions now.
Okay. Some of these are from previous slides as well. In quotation marks, use theory in design work. Does this mean use theory in designing one study or theory around a specific type of case study?
Oh, theory. Oh, you're talking about using the theory. So the theory, theory is just, we are not talking about a grand theory, like established theory. We are talking about just having a conceptual framework to define all of your component of the study. And the component is like proposition and your cases and your sample. All of these makes your conceptual framework. And I will further talk about the theory, but yeah, the theory is not a grand theory, and it's just the way that you plan your study using a conceptual framework or a conceptual, yeah, it's just a conceptual framework, or you can call it a template, a theory
Okay.
that you develop and later on you use it to develop your study.
Okay. Another previous slide, if you use a focus group, does it need to be made of different people than the people in an interview?
Does not need to. Sometimes you want to have same people being both interview and focus group, because you may use different question, or you may want to see their answer when it comes into the group interview, in a focus interview. Does not have to, people don't have to be specifically different people.
Okay. And then you mentioned intervention in the exploratory case study design, but don't interventions indicate experimental design?
Yeah, so I was also, so the intervention is basically is not in a way that we have it in experimental, that we manipulate it. So in experimental design, we really bring intervention for the purpose of studying this, I don't know, program, software to teach a course, and we want to explore the effect of this. But in the case study, basically they are using some sort of intervention, like in that nurse patient example, nurses started using some sort of procedure. And now a case study researcher wants to explore how this new procedure may affect the patient, their relationship. So it's not clear cut. And again, we are not manipulating. It's already there. We just go there to explore. But in experimental, we really manipulate and bring the intervention for the purpose of the study.
Okay. Here's another one. For the embedded single case, could you look at corporate policy? What should happen? That's in parentheses. Could you look at corporate policy with a selected group or department? What actually does happen?
Yes, so for the embedded, like we are talking about here, embedded single case study, you have one organization and then 2 unit of analysis. So in 2 unit of analysis, one is the policy, one can be, you can even switch on different policy of different department, or you can talk about any other issues in other departments. As long as you have 2 unit of analysis, it goes under embedded, because there are 2 of them. One is policy, the other one is something else in the department, whatever it is. Then it goes under this type of design.
Okay, and then going back to these different types of case studies, there's a question about the Tolson study. What is the bounded system? This person doesn't see how the parameters could exist around women with Parkinson's.
So here, again, I did not particularly read it, but I believe that as I read the abstract, the particular women that they had, they were specific group of women. If you don't really specify your women, like in this case, then it cannot be a case study, because there are unlimited number of women that you can go and understand their need with Parkinson's disease, right? But in this case, they had a specific group of women that they wanted to learn about them.
Okay, thank you. That's it for now. We still have one more question, and we'll save that to the end.
Okay, so going to the next slide. Okay, so this is just the example that related to single studies versus multiple case studies. So we may move to the next slide, please. Okay, so data collection. As I mentioned earlier, hallmark of a case study is using multiple data from multiple sources really should be collected. And if we do that, we enhance the credibility of our study. As I mentioned, there are different sources, documentation, for example, archive, record, interview, observation. Sometimes you can use even artifacts depending on your study and kind of try to use that to compare and contrast with your other source of data and survey. And so each of these data sources, but actually they are like a pieces of puzzle that you put them together. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not that we separately analyze survey, then separately analyze interview. No, we try to analyze them together and compare and contrast what we have. So basically, we try to triangulate and making sure that whatever we find out is really valid. We use it toward validation of our findings. Okay, so next. So one of the issues that is related to case study, because we are saying we use multiple sources of data, then we end up with the issue of managing these multiple sources of data. And that's one of the concern actually related to case study, particularly when we go with multiple cases, then it gets even harder to manage our data. So because of that, it is really recommended to use software, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, or software that help you code your data, link the data, and they have just this mapping, networking tools. So it's strongly recommended for a researcher in case study to use these softwares. So if you go to the next slide, David. Okay, so here are the list of some of the software that you may use. So NVivo, that is really famous, you know, that you heard about it a lot, and University of Phoenix offer it to the students and faculty. It's one of them that help you with coding, aggregation, query, and visualization of your data as well. There are some others that are free that you may explore, but again, if you have access to NVivo, then the recommendation is going with NVivo. I just wanted to list the ones that are available here. This one, the first one, Deduz, is web-based, so you can just use it online. You don't need to download it. So that's the advantage of that as well. So yes, we really recommend you to use this, particularly NVivo can help you a lot.
We have a couple questions on the previous slide about the data collection with the hallmark. Can you use an embedded case study to contrast two groups of people? For example, kids who drink soda versus kids who do not drink soda within the same organization?
You do. So you have embedded case study. However, you cannot mix these issues together. Like for each unit of analysis, so kids who drink soda is one unit of analysis, kids who don't is another unit of analysis. And then you need to have at least 3 data sources for each of these units of analysis. And then at the end, actually, you would compare these cases. Yes, that's the beauty of having that design, because you get to compare them. But it's a little bit complex. You see that it takes more work. For each of them, you have to have 3 sources of data. once you really put together the finding, then you compare and contrast these two units of analysis.
Okay, and then another question in regards to data collection is, could field notes be one source and then use the interviews and maybe information about the organization as other sources?
Field notes can be one source. Information regarding organization should be clarified. If it's just like how specific is that information, it has to be like a documentation or archive record. If that's the case, yes, you can use it. In a way, it shouldn't be too general information. The information should be really useful and aligned with your research question and problem. Then yes, you can use them.
Okay, thank you. Is this the slide that you want right now?
Yes. Okay, so then there are multiple, there are basically different case study analytical techniques, really, data analysis. Once you collect your data, then you need to analyze them, right? So again, these are based on Yin suggestion. So you may go with pattern matching, like comparing your data with what you actually expected or predicted to have. Often you try to link it with your proposition. You may go with explanation building, like kind of going through the collecting data, explaining, and then adding more to previous explanation. You may go with the detailed, precise tracing of the events if you're collecting data about events. So that's like a time-wise going over time series of analysis of data events. Sometimes you may use the logic model specifying a complex chain of events over time. And then this cross-case synthesis, that's really similar to pattern matching, but you would add everything in a table and compare them. And I understand that for I really refer you to further read the details. That these brief explanation may not be good enough, but I recommend you to go and read Yin for further details. Next slide. Okay, so that's related to rule of theory in case study, and again, this has been recommended a lot. All of them, Yin and Miriam and Steck, they recommended to use a theory, but the theory is not a grand theory. Again, it's just like a template that you would use, and you put your proposition, you put your other component of your study, and you try to follow that template. And when we are saying that when you have this proposition and conceptual framework, we would be more equipped to come up with a generalization. But don't forget that this is not like a statistical generalization that we have in quantitative studies. Here, we simply collect information data regarding cases. And the reason we call it analytical and generalization is because you have a proposition and you collect information data related to case or cases, and then you try to compare your result with your original proposition. And if it matches with what you originally hypothesis or propose, then you can say that you endorse that. If not, you may change. So basically, you compare, you bring your result from your cases and compare with your original proposition to end up with the statement for generalizing. But again, we got to be careful about generalization because you specifically focus on one context, so you can only apply the result in a similar context. You cannot generalize it to a larger population the way that we do in quantitative studies. So be careful about using this generalization. The reason that I added generalization word actually was because Yin did that, but really it's just application of what you find in similar contexts. That's all that you can do in case studies. Okay, and then the concern that I mentioned, there are a number of concerns. The first one is related to the rigorousness and rigor of the study, whether it's trustworthy or not, the case studies. And the next one, little basis for generalization. So this is related to what I just said. You cannot generalize it to the large population, only to a particular situation similar to your case. So there are some concern that, oh, what if we don't find very similar context? Then there is a very limited area or context that you can actually apply your study. So yes, there is. This is true that in reality there are specific places that you can only apply your study. And also the other concern is that it's a lot of data you need to collect. It may take a long time for you, particularly if you go with multiple units of analysis, it would get really large. So yes, that's another concern. But if you are interested in doing case study, we really recommend you to use the softwares NVivo for managing your data. In addition, there are some approach and procedure that you can take to basically improve the trustworthiness of your study to address the first concern regarding the validity of your study. So, David, if you go to the next one.
Can you take a couple questions, or you want to keep going? The first question is, can narrative inquiry be used as one design? I think I might have jinxed her. Maybe she didn't want to answer that question. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to bring her back up. Just bear with me for a second. There she is. All right. You're back.
I was not there? Okay.
I thought you got scared of the question and just left.
Go ahead, David.
Here's the question. It says, can narrative inquiry be used as one design?
Narrative inquiry is, yes, it's a qualitative design, obviously, but it's not related to case study. It's yet another qualitative design, but it is not case study. So case study is totally different. Narrative inquiry is another qualitative design.
Okay. Another question is, can you use interview data from 3 different groups as the 3 sources of data? For example, when studying college student retention, could you interview faculty, staff, and students as the 3 data sources?
Yes, for triangulation, sometimes you can go with triangulating 3 different sort of people, really, that you can do, yes.
Okay, thank you for those responses. I'll keep going now.
Okay, so these are related to validating your data. So again, as I explained, there are concerns related to trustworthiness of the case studies. So you are really recommended to follow these procedures to keep up with the validating of your data. So the first one is related to construct validity. So the construct validity, the meaning is really kind of having a correct operational measure or concept. So in order to achieve that, you are going to use the triangulation, as I mentioned, multiple sources of evidence or data. You may also use member check once you are collecting your data. Asking the audience, the participants, sometimes you can send back the collected data and ask them to review the collected data and making sure that what you collected from them is what exactly they meant. So that's one way of keeping up with this construct validity. And the second one is the internal validity. So when particularly for explanatory study that you were trying to learn about some sort of causal relationship, you gotta be careful using one of those established analytic techniques that I just explained, particularly using perhaps pattern matching would be very useful. So the point is here not to come up with some not established analytical techniques, or sometimes not having any techniques, because I have seen sometimes researchers, just if you ask them what was exactly your technique, they don't really know, or they haven't followed any prescribed pre-established techniques. So here you need to back up yourself and only use the techniques that are recommended by one of these authors. Now here we are talking about Yin. For external validity, we try to establish the domain for generalization. Again, here we talk about the theory in single case study, but be careful. Again, we are not talking about a grand theory. We are not talking about like experiential learning theory. No, it's just a theory that you develop at the beginning of your study. And now you come back and say that, oh, whether what I thought at the beginning was right or not, depending on the result that you collected from your case study. If you have multiple case studies, then you may want to compare them as well. And so there should be a logical comparison, like the question that we have from someone, that kids who drink soda versus the kids who don't drink soda, that's like a two unit of analysis that you get to compare and contrast, and at the end, by comparing and contrasting, you reach to some conclusion and generalization. And the last thing is reliability. So reliability means repeatability. So basically, how can people repeat the same, how much if people repeat the same procedure would end up with the same result. That's reliability. So in order to achieve a reliability, you got to use protocols. So in order to collect your data for the interview, for even like observation and collecting survey, there are particular protocols that you got to follow. And if you go to Yin again, they provided the clear guidelines that you need to follow those guidelines. And if you don't follow the guidelines, obviously people cannot verify the reliability of your procedure. So make sure that when you are doing the case study, you're using the case study protocol. And also use databases, as earlier we mentioned, for managing your data and coding your data. Okay, so now the case study, as I mentioned, it's you see that it's a lot. So you end up with a lot of data, and obviously when you want to put together a report, it can be confusing if you don't follow particular procedure and structure. So again, these are the suggestions by Yin. There are different structure that you may follow. So the first one is maybe the most common one, which makes sense. You just start your report with the problem, your literature review, method finding, conclusion, implication. That's just like makes sense a lot. If happen that you have two cases, two unit of analysis, then you may want to go with comparative, that basically you explain everything related to one case, like starting with same linear structure problem, research review, method finding, all the way down, and again the other one, and then at the end you need to put together the conclusion and compare and contrast your case. That's one structure. The other recommendation is like going with the time order, like present the everything based on the time, and particularly when it comes to your method section, you go with present the evidence as you collect the data and you provide them with the time order. Theory buildings. So this is particularly related when you want to you have basically multiple cases that you want to have. You had different proposition and you want to show how each of them you end up with building a theory or not, perhaps. So again, you may just sort of your or arrange your report based on reaching to conclusion for each of these theory or not. That's how you can put together your report. And then there are two other structure that Yin suggested that it was, to me, was not really, I don't, again, like I'm just saying that he was suggested, but perhaps the other structure were better. So he was saying that it's just like you provide report about one group and then provide the conclusion and then go to next unit of your analysis and provide the conclusion. And the last one is just like providing information without any specific order related to their importance. But again, to me, it doesn't, perhaps the other structure are more useful if you want to put together a case study report. Obviously, this is not how you go. For your dissertation, you just go with the order that they ask for, as far as the recommendation. If you're developing a manuscript, you go with the structure of the manuscript report. If you're providing for a company, it's not the manuscript. If it is not the manuscript as well, the linear structure.
Okay. Do you want a question?
I think yes, and I guess we are at the end. If you go to the next slide.
You see it there?
Yeah, so what are the questions? Yeah.
One participant said that they always understood that we do not create hypotheses on qualitative studies.
Yeah, so this is not when we are talking about proposition here, is not the clear-cut hypothesis. It's just a statement. Sometimes, like I mentioned in the exploratory, that you are simply explore. It can be just even the purpose. It's not the hypothesis that we have in the quantitative study, but also as compared to other qualitative design, like in ethnography, we over there we don't even start with this proposition, but here in case study we start with some statement. So the statement basically is just like what you expect to receive, but again, what I say, you may not be able to endorse your statement and you may end up revising it. So it's not the hypothesis that clear cut, is just some expectation that you may have. And for exploratory, it's just the purpose of your study, can be your proposition.
Okay. And then our last question is about renew this in order to conduct research? And if so, how do I go about doing that?
Yes, so you always need to have that one renew in order to get the IRB approval. So how do you go about it? I guess if you go to irb.net, perhaps they have a link. So I think the link is just citi.net or .org that you go, or maybe you want to go to irb.net and then over there you can see the link. But yes, you do need to have them. Yeah.
I agree. I think the link is in there with IRB.net. Here's a couple more questions because I know we're over a little bit. When using archive data, there can be quantitative data. Can we use this type of data in a case study?
So basically, case study can include quantitative data. Definitely, that's yes. But if you decide to go with only qualitative case study, then including quantitative data would not be acceptable. So if you go with case study including quantitative data, it would make your study a little bit more complicated, as you are going to have a mixed method study because you are mixing quantitative with qualitative. And then when you are going to analyze your quantitative data, obviously you need to use some statistical analysis. So the answer is yes, case study can include quantitative data, but it may make your study more complex because it brings additional statistical analysis.
Okay, thank you. And then our last question here is more like a confirmation of an example. So a proposition is what you expect based on the literature, experience, etc., correct? And if you are investigating to see if you guess right, is that correct?
Correct. Yes, correct.
Okay. And then someone indicated that they put the link for the city certificate. The link to that is in the chat box. So thank you, Ryan, for letting us know that. And if you did that, thank you, or whoever did that, thank you. And that's all the questions we have right now. Dr. Cabrici, I remember just kind of personal when you and I first started to get to know each other, you made a recommendation to me to become an expert in one type of methodology, and you mentioned case study. So I can see that this is really your expertise now. And I don't know if that's true or not, but you are definitely an expert on it. And I can see that this design is near and dear to your heart. You seem to know everything about it, and you speak very naturally about it. I mean, you definitely, no questions asked, that you know your content on this design.
Thank you, David. Thank you. So I hope everyone find this very brief overview useful. There are some references that I included at the end. Go ahead and review these for further information. Also, we have this asynchronous discussion thread in our group, research methodology group. So please go ahead and add your questions there. So other people, if they have the same question, they may review that discussion thread and learn about the answer. And our next design meeting would be in March 15, I guess, and it's a content analysis. So I invite everyone join the next meeting, and please let everybody else know, your students, your colleagues. We love to everyone here for conversation related to content analysis. Dr. Liz Johnson and Eric Bean are the leader of that design. And yeah.
I'm sorry, will the slides and a record, I know the recording will be distributed for this session, but will you be able to distribute slides as well, or are you keeping those to yourself?
No, I will share the slides for sure.
Okay, wonderful. You had a lot of people asking for that, so that's a great sign that it's very useful.
Thank you. Okay, so well, I very good. I invite everyone to continuously check on our website. We have materials there, and we like you to be part of this group, really. So the monthly webinars are one way to communicate with you, but we can also have blogs there. And as I mentioned, the discussion thread, these are different ways of communicating and talking about different designs. So the purpose is really learning about different research designs, quantitative as well as qualitative. And go ahead and review our schedule. Till end of this year, 2018, every month we have one webinar. In some months, we have 2 webinars. So I invite you to review the schedule. And actually, there is a link that I added to the website. It's called webinar, design webinars. And I'm going to upload all the recording of the session to that link. So you can just go and listen to the recording of previous sessions as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Thank you, David, for your help and facilitating this session as well.